So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our series, Balancing Biodiversity Conservation with Development Pressure in Urban Landscapes. My name is Purnima Govindarajulu, and I'm the unit head for Species Conservation Science in the Ecosystems and Biodiversity branch in the BC Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, also called Walrus. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Wasanich people here on the Saanich Peninsula in southern Vancouver Island. I would ask everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands that you're joining us from today. Okay, we are at the midpoint of our webinar series, and this is the fourth webinar. These webinars go every Tuesday. They started on the 4th of February and they'll continue till the 18th of March. And this is a collaboration between Walrus and the Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative. The aim of this webinar is to explore the complex challenges of balancing rapid development with the vital need to conserve our biodiversity, especially in the face of the housing mandate and the rapid development that's going on in many areas to meet the metrics of this mandate. We have been exploring a diversity of topics up to now, such as regulatory frameworks, case studies, mitigation guidelines, and yet to come in the next webinars are guidance and planning tools. But today we will focus on data and spatial tools. Katrina Stipec, who will be speaking first, will be presenting on BC Conservation Data Center 101, providing information on species and ecosystems in BC and the tools that they offer. And then Jared Maida from Environment and Climate Change Canada will be focusing his presentation on Critical Habitat 101, an introduction for local governments and professionals. But before we get into the meat of our webinar, just a few housekeeping details. There will be a dedicated question and answer session at the end of both presentations. So we'll have both presentations and then the Q&A. There is a little icon in your toolbar, so familiarize yourself with that and put your questions in there. And you can add your questions throughout the webinar, both speakers, because we'll be moving into the Q&A right after the presentations, and time has usually been short. Also, in the Q&A, just review the questions that have already been posted because you can upvote them. And then when I moderate the question and answer session, I'll pick the questions that have been upvoted the most, which shows that's what the audience is most interested in, just so we cover the questions of most interest. There's also a chat function, but use that for comments or networking. Do not post your questions there because we're trying to use the Q&A tool. If you're having technical issues, try refreshing your browser or checking your internet connection. If the problem persists, try reaching out to Ali. Ali is with the Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative and has been providing us with fantastic technical support throughout this webinar series, and she'll do her best to help you. We also have a survey at the end of the webinar, but I'll come to that at the end when the webinar is done. But now, before we get into the actual webinar, we're going to start off with an icebreaker, and mainly to know where you're joining from. So use either your phone to use a QR code or the link. Shortly, we'll have a view of a map of BC and the globe. Ali will share that. And if you can go to the website, just drop a pin approximately where you are, and that gives us a sense of where you're joining us from. So it looks like people are already on it because it's the fourth webinar, and you're all masters at this point. Yeah, this has been the pattern that we've been seeing throughout the webinar series. A lot of people are concentrated in the southern parts of the province, Thompson-Okanagan, Vancouver Island, Lower Mainland, Kootenays. And that's not surprising because that's where most people live. So it kind of reflects the population density. Um, so that's great. Oh, there's someone from Northern BC. That's great. Welcome. And a few people from outside of BC. So that's great. I'm going to just give a few more seconds as there are more points appearing. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And this will be captured in the recording. And something I forgot to say was that all these webinars are being recorded and they'll be posted on the Thompson-Nicola website, Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative website. Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce my first speaker of the day. Katrina Stipec is Program Lead, Data and Information with the Conservation Data Center in Walrus. She has a passion for client service and ensuring access to BC species and ecosystem data and information through CDC tools. I also noticed that she's been in this position since 2005. So it's her 20th anniversary year. So welcome, Katrina, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I know 20 years flies by. Here, I'm going to start sharing my screen now and get that slideshow going. And I hope you can all now see my screen. So I'll proceed, assuming everyone can see what I'm showing here. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. As introduced, my name is Katrina Stipec, and I work in the data management unit of the Conservation Data Center, and yes, coming up on 20 years now. And I'll be presenting today the work that the CDC does and the data and information we can provide to help you make informed decisions. I first want to acknowledge that the CDC carries out its work on the traditional territories of First Nations throughout BC. I personally am presenting today from the unceded territory of the Wasanich Nation, whose traditional language is Senchothan, which they actually teach in our local schools, which is wonderful. I live in Brentwood Bay, and that's home of the Sartlip community, and it's located just north of Victoria. I'll be talking about the CDC and our background, what our core responsibilities are, including conservation status assessments and mapping, a bit about those data products, and introduce our online tools and what our data are used for. So currently this CDC is made up of 13 people. We have the units of zoology, botany, ecology, and data management. We're somewhat unique within the BC government, as we're also a member of a global nonprofit organization called NatureServe and a national nonprofit called NatureServe Canada. So each province, territory, and state has a CDC equivalent, which totals over 60 programs. The NatureServe network provides repeatable, standardized biodiversity data to support conservation action. And we use common methods for the data we produce, which allows it to be comparable across the network. And that comparability allows cross-border analysis of the network data and helps us with efficient data sharing and knowledge sharing between the network programs. The Canadian provinces and territories, except for Quebec, are also members of NatureServe Canada, and that's a nonprofit registered charity, and it helps to facilitate national scale projects and build the partnerships between the Canadian CDCs and our federal organizations, including these associate members. And some of these also provide funding to help support our work of mapping and ranking. Each program in the NatureServe network is tasked with helping to answer these questions in their jurisdiction. So of course, in our case, in BC, what species and ecological communities occur here? How are they doing here? So in other words, what are their risk of extirpation from BC? Where are those at risk found or documented? How are they doing at that location? And in BC, we're also working on data products that help us determine potentially where they might be found, those at risk. And we address those previous questions by doing these core tasks. First, we compile and report out the list of species and ecological communities that occur in BC. And that's currently, we're reporting out over 24,000 elements or species and ecological communities. Next, we assess the risk of extirpation from the province. And we conduct conservation status assessments that assign a rank that reflects how at risk an element is of extirpation from BC. Thirdly, we map the locations of those elements at risk. The NatureServe standard and our core data product or spatial data product is element occurrence mapping or EOs. In BC, as said, we're also working on range data and species habitat modeling. And very importantly, we make the data and information accessible through our online tools or through our data request email. And I want to point out that these photos here show some of our CDC staff in the field, which everyone loves to do. However, most of our work does rely on additional data sources, both from within the BC government, but also from external sources. So we're not limited. We pull from published and unpublished reports, citizen science, such as iNaturalist, museum specimens, and incidental sightings that are provided from other partners or individuals. So if you're out in the field or even on your weekend gathering iNat data, which more and more people are, then we do access that data through partnership with iNaturalist as well. So we then assess how at risk an element is, and that's based on standard NatureServe methodology and considers factors such as rarity, threats, and trends. And within there's a number of factors considered. The result of that assessment is a conservation status rank. And the ranks are represented by S1 to S5. The S stands for subnational, in this case, BC. S1 is the most critically imperiled, most at risk of extirpation, to S5, which is being secure. And there are additional ranks such as SNR, SA, got extirpated, presumed extirpated, range ranks, modifiers. I won't go into all of those. They can be found on the website. But the point is that there are complexities around the status ranks. They're information rich, which is great, but it also makes it more challenging to interpret, to search on, and to report on. So species and ecosystems in BC are also grouped into more simplified categories called the BC red, blue, and yellow list. The red list being most at risk, the yellow list being least at risk, with some overlap. As said, the BC list is simplification, a simplified reflection of the risk of extirpation. It's not a regulatory or legal list. It can be used, however, to inform legal designation under various species at risk related legislation, and can be used to help prioritize conservation actions. The CDC maps the locations of those species and ecological communities that are at risk. I'll speak in a bit more detail about element occurrences. However, I want to touch quickly on other spatial data products that we're working on. The potential or range data are likely to be available through the BC Data Catalog this coming fiscal, and they're useful for showing broadly the geographic area that a species can be found. In BC, we've based these on ecosection line work for species and biogeoclimatic line work for ecological communities. I see a thumbs up. That's great. I know people are waiting for this. However, range data, they don't reflect specific habitat needs. They're over-inclusive since the element doesn't occur in all areas of its expected range. So the next step is our species habitat modeling project. And we've started this by building on existing frameworks developed by other organizations, including NatureServe. We've been compiling predictor data and species data sources and working on standards and documentation. And we're now starting to apply those methods to individual species as test cases. So all three of these data products together, of course, will be a great way to help fill data gaps and serve to get a good overall picture of, species and ecosystems at risk in the province. I do want to touch on EOs, or element occurrences, a bit because they are our main spatial data product and they can be misunderstood. I just want to clarify that an EO documents where an element is or was present, a known documented location. An EO, however, is distinct from an observation. It's a value-added product where observations are vetted for reliability and conservation significance. So it should be a location that can be managed for and that supports the ongoing persistence of that element. A simple example of this is that a bird flying overhead in a parking lot is a perfectly good observation. However, it wouldn't be mapped as an EO. A bird's nest or a bird with recurring evidence in suitable habitat could be mapped as an EO. An EO is always a polygon. It's not obscuring a precise location. Rather, it is delineating where the element occurrence fills, like where the habitat is, or reflects the uncertainty associated with the source data. We basically want to make sure we capture where the element actually is on the ground so that you know where it could be. Every source of data has uncertainties, and we want to build that into our data. An EO reflects a population or breeding distribution. So one EO can have multiple separate polygons included in it. And those criteria that help us in our mapping to determine what is or isn't an EO and how to map it is set by NatureServe. This again keeps our methods in line with the network and allows that data to be comparable and standard. 90% of our detailed element occurrence data are publicly available. However, a small number are secured. There's a couple reasons for this. One being that the species is considered susceptible to harm, and there's a list that's available online that tells you which species these are. Examples are western rattlesnake at risk of persecution, or falcons at risk of collection. Another reason may be that the data submitter or landowner has requested the data be restricted from public. Either way, if you encounter one of these mass polygons, it's important to reach out to us and we can provide the information if it makes sense to do so, if it's needed. So please do reach out. Where can you find this information? I'll provide a quick summary here and then do a quick walkthrough of each of these tools. BC Species and Ecosystems Explorer, or BCSEE, is a tool that allows you to search by various criteria and provides tabular results that meet that criteria. It reflects the latest taxonomy and at this time lists over 24,000 elements in BC. CDC iMap is based on iMap BC and is our spatial mapping application for accessing element occurrence data. So you can print EO reports to PDF or export to shapefile or Excel. And the secure version listed here is available to those with a BC IDER, so internal to BC government, who also have access to the secure CDC data. And then our tools and data are also available through the BC data catalog for download. So I'm going to start with the BC Species and Ecosystems Explorer. You can see that you can do a quick search with those categories. You can search by name, and it will dynamically give you some results for that. We'll search by group. So within animals, you can see all the invertebrate groups you can search by, ecological communities. For this one, we're going to pick plants. We can search by conservation status or legal designation, so the BC red or blue list. Let's pick red and blue as they're considered at risk. You can also choose provincial status, so the various S ranks, or global status, or COSIUIC status. In this case, we'll choose a legal designation of Sarah listed species as well, but you can see the other options here. So search by area allows you to upload an area of interest or draw one, or pick from these predefined regions. I think in this case, we'll choose regional district. And you can pick on the map or pick from this list. You can choose district of central, or no, let's go central Kootenai. And we can see on the map too where it's been highlighted. Other search options include biogeoclimatic units, native or endemic, etc., and habitat type limited to species only. Well, we'll do a search on what we have so far. So we have 61 records as a result. And if we scroll down and want to remember what we searched on, the search criteria is very useful. And there's the citation if you want to cite this. Let's have a look at the reports section. So in reports, you can look at just information about the species or the conservation status and other reports. Back to the results, we'll click on the map known locations. So this is all provincial locations of that species. And you can see a summary of occurrence. If you click on full record, it takes you to CDC iMap, which we won't do here. Back to the results, you can export what you see on the screen. I would recommend summary data. It gives you the most information. Conservation status gives you information about conservation status. And the results choice just gives you what you see on the screen. So it's a bit limited in what it gives you. And we're going to move on now to CDC iMap. So this is where you access spatial data, and the CDC layers are all found under fish, wildlife, and plant species. Under the publicly available layer, you can click on any of those arrows to get to the metadata, which is really useful for data contacts and information about the layer. We're going to zoom in a bit to turn these layers on. And this is a very busy part of the BC Kamloops. So we're going to turn off the masked layer. Just reach out to us. It's still very busy. I always recommend using a find tool and not just eyeballing what's there. I tend to use the quickest way to get the data, which is the find data tools. So we'll choose rectangle. Make sure you're only identifying on the layers you're interested in, otherwise you get a lot of other information. So we'll choose the CDC layers here. And I'll draw a polygon. And we'll see what comes out. There's 24 results, and you can click on an individual occurrence to see more information. Or you can export all of that information to a shapefile, CSV, or PDF report. You can view it in a table format and then export from here as well to CSV or Excel. But let's go back to list. Spatial query does the same thing, but walks you through it a bit more. It wants to know what you're interested in. And here you can choose uploaded layer if you had uploaded a shapefile or KML, or drew a graphic or current extent. So there's different options here. Quick select filter is if you want to just choose by one attribute. So let's choose English name, for example, and we'll just pick the top one that comes up here. We're interested in abbreviated bluegrass, and you can see there are 3 element occurrences in the province, and you have the same options. I do want to show you, in addition, how to add the critical habitat layer, which you'll be learning a bit more about. So we can search for this and add in the federally listed critical habitat layer. This is where you can also add in lots of other information. So we'll just zoom in and have a quick look at the critical habitat. Turn off the CDC data, perhaps, make it a bit faster. And it'll look messy because there's a lot in the area. We can use the same find tools to see what's in our area of interest. I will add that the next iteration of CDC iMap, which is EcoAtlas BC, the way you see the results is going to be much more intuitive. You will see that 16 results came from critical habitat layer, and it will be a little more viewer friendly. That's coming very soon. Next, I just wanted to include this for reference back when you get the copy of this. So this will be your reference of just additional layers I always recommend people use to supplement, of course, CDC data, which has its own data limitations for sure. The BC Data Catalog is where you can go to view metadata, contacts, and download the data. So here, let's look at this. The CDC data are listed here. We'll look at the publicly available occurrences that you can download. And here you can see there's a lot of information about the layer, as well as the data contacts. I use this a lot for other data sets. And then if we want to download that data, we can go to the warehouse and access download, pick our coordinate system, pick our format, so geodatabase, shapefile. If we want an area of interest, we can specify it, or we can just download the whole provincial data set here. Add in your email, and then you will get it. Other options include web map service, so direct access or direct connection, KML, and ArcGIS Online. And I just want to show you that you can also find the critical habitat here for BC. And just to note that this is still federal data, it's Environment Canada data, but it's a great place to go to find metadata about the layer and download it as you did this CDC data. And of course, to find the contact for the federal critical habitat data. So BC has agreed to serve this through the BC Data Catalog, but it's still federal data. And here, I just wanted to finally give you an idea of the clients that we have contacting us. We can't capture the many thousands that access our online tools, but we respond to about 700 to 800 requests per year. And this is just a subset of how people may use the data. There's, of course, as many uses as there are varied interests in conservation or biodiversity information. And that ends my presentation. And please reach out with any questions. And I will pass the baton to Jared.
Thank you, Katrina. That was excellent. And it looks like people are really looking forward to your new tools that are coming online soon. So that's really great. So I'm going to just say that we're going to hold questions. I see there are already questions for Katrina in the Q&A. If you haven't used the Q&A, familiarize yourself, go put in your questions and upvote questions for Katrina. But in the meantime, I'm going to request Jared come back on, and he's our second speaker for the day today. And I'll give a brief introduction. Jared is species at risk biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service in the Pacific region. He works on recovery planning on a suite of species in BC. And that includes like recovery document writing, critical habitat identification, and support and implementation of projects targeting SAR species at risk, recovery, and conservation. So over to you now, Jared.
Okay, thank you, Purnima. Thank you, everyone. Let's do this whole share screen charade. Make sure that we get it. Now I think this is being shared, and if I go like this, in theory,
looks good.
Everyone sees what this presentation screen. Okay. Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the organizers, Purnima and Ali in particular, for having me, and thank you for allowing me to be part of your, I guess, lunch hour for everyone that's kind of tuned in and coming to participate. So yes, my name is Jared. I'm, as Purnima outlined, I'm a species at risk biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service here in the Pacific region, and/or better known as British Columbia. We have a sub-regional office in Kelowna on the traditional territory of the Syilx people, and so that is where I work out of as well. So let's just jump right into it. So, okay, we're already, next slide. Okay, so the Canadian Wildlife Service. CWS is a branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and a core areas and responsibility are essentially the management and conservation of migratory birds and species at risk in Canada, as well as the protection and management of nationally important habitat for wildlife. And so the primary functions of CWS pretty wide-ranging, including scientific, regulatory, property management, policy, and financial support work as well. And so I listed a handful of kind of units, you could say, or teams in the CWS Pacific region. So that's anywhere from regulatory affairs to protected areas, Indigenous relations, stewardship, and then where I work out of is the species at risk recovery. CWS manages approximately 54 national wildlife areas and approximately 92 migratory bird sanctuaries across Canada. And I don't actually know the date of when those numbers are from, so that could be outdated and we could be a little bit more than that as well at this given time. There are three kind of primary federal wildlife laws and their subsequent relations that the CWS core function is essentially mandated by. And so firstly, the Migratory Birds Convention Act and the subsequent Migratory Birds Regulations, as well as Migratory Bird Sanctuary Regulations. There's the Canadian Wildlife Act and its subsequent wildlife area regulations. And so this is more in like related to national wildlife areas, etc. And then of course, the Species at Risk Act. And in particular, in this conversation today, we'll be talking about critical habitat. So all federal wildlife laws and laws in general kind of have these three primary components. Firstly is prescriptions. And so those direct government officials and departments about what to do and how to do it. And so this, you can think of this as like those policies. Prohibitions, so direct all citizens on what not to do. And so when we're talking about the SARA, we're talking about the general prohibitions and critical habitat prohibitions, for example. And those general prohibitions being protection of individuals, protection of residences, and then obviously the protection of critical habitat. And then we have what's called permissions. And these provide exceptions or permits, if you will, for all citizens to contravene the prohibitions under certain circumstances. And so this is an example of this would be Section 73 permitting under the Species at Risk Act. And generally speaking, where do these laws apply in BC? And so for the Migratory Bird Convention Act and its in migratory bird regulations, those essentially are everywhere on all lands and waters in Canada. As far as migratory bird sanctuary regulations, the Canadian Wildlife Act, the wildlife area regulations, those are kind of apply on federal bird sanctuaries and national wildlife areas in Canada. And then the SARA, the Species at Risk Act, applies on all lands and waters in Canada, okay? And it's just like how it applies depends on the species and it depends on the land tenures as well. And we'll get into a little bit of that as we kind of progress through this conversation. So the SARA, the Species at Risk Act was passed 23 years ago now in 2002. It includes well over, I'm going to say well over because I've had this number in slides for the last handful of years. So it includes over 520 plants and animals in Canada. And the purpose of the SARA is generally speaking three-pronged, okay? It's to prevent the species from becoming extinct or extirpated. And it's to recover wildlife species that are extirpated, endangered, or threatened as a result of human activity. And it is to manage species of special concern species to prevent them from becoming further at risk. So further at risk, endangered or threatened of becoming extinct. Under the SARA, conservation in Canada is a shared jurisdiction and shared responsibility. So the federal SARA is meant to support provincial legislation and vice versa through bilateral accords between provinces, because provinces remain the management authorities on most wildlife on provincial and private lands in Canada. And of course, plants and animals don't recognize, quote unquote, artificial jurisdictional boundaries and are found in or maybe move across borders of more than one province or territory or areas, etc. So the federal SARA provides a consistent approach for helping conserve species across Canada. And under that 1996 Accord for the Protection of Species at Risk, federal, provincial, and territorial governments agreed to establish complementary legislation and programs that provide for effective protection of species at risk, including the protection for the habitat of threatened and endangered species. And the structure of the SARA is such that the first and primary opportunity to protect and manage and conserve non-migratory birds and terrestrial species at risk and their habitat on non-federal lands lies with the province. And so, generally speaking, the federal government leads on conservation, recovery, management of migratory birds and aquatic species, and then of course, obviously, federal lands. And then essentially the province is lead on all other terrestrial species when it comes to management and recovery and conservation. Okay, so let's get into critical habitat. What is critical habitat? And better known as CH, because us in government and folks love acronyms. And so as defined by the SARA, critical habitat is the habitat that is necessary for the survival or recovery of a listed wildlife species, and that is identified as the species critical habitat in a recovery strategy or action plan for the species. So there's a handful of kind of points of this definition that I've underlined. And so first of all, necessary for the survival recovery, and then subsequently, critical habitat it is only identified if it is included in a recovery strategy or an action plan, and those recovery strategies or action plans are posted online for the public to see. Critical habitat at the time is identified to the extent possible, and that can mean a variety of different things. That can mean full identification of critical habitat. Critical habitat at the time could be partially identified, and on relatively rare occurrences, critical habitat might be unavailable. And it's based on best available information that's available out there. And Katrina talked about CDC data and et cetera, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Information on species listing, COSEWIC assessments, recovery documents, including critical habitat information, it can be found on the SAR public registry. So there's a handful of different iterations of critical habitat. And so there's candidate and draft critical habitat, there's proposed critical habitat, and there's final critical habitat. And essentially all we need to know for this component is that candidate or draft critical habitat is critical habitat that is in development. It's not currently shown or presented in a proposed or final recovery strategy, and those documents in that process is undergoing. Proposed CH is found in a proposed recovery strategy or proposed action plan, and recovery documents are posted as proposed on the SAR public registry for 60-day public comment period before being posted as final, and that includes the associated critical habitat. And then obviously, final critical habitat is identified and presented in a final recovery document. And as a reminder, those are recovery strategies or action plans. So critical habitat has 3 or 4 main parts. And so we all know about the maps and where it is, etc. But really to fully interpret and fully understand a species CH, you need to also be aware of these other 3 or 4 parts. And so one is the map of the boundaries. Where could CH be found? Where is it found? And then there will be a list of the biophysical attributes necessary for the survival and recovery of the species. There will be examples of activities likely to destroy CH. And then lastly, there may be a schedule of studies to further identify CH in the future. And this is as applicable. And so there might be times due to data inefficiencies, etc., that critical habitat might not be fully completed and fully identified to fully support the species population and distribution objectives. And so if that is the case, a schedule of studies will be developed to come up with a plan for how to further refine and update and include the appropriate critical habitat at a later date. Okay. So firstly, map boundaries. These are the geospatial areas extent of CHID. It outlines where CH is found or where CH can be found on the landscape. And it's identified in a number of ways. Species occurrence records, habitat modeling, species distribution modeling, etc., or a mixture of both. And so here's an example of a map for our Great Basin spadefoot. And so this is a map that you will find, a PDF map that you'll find in the species in the spadefoot's recovery strategy document. And so importantly, as I harp back to Katrina's conversation, it's, and talking about best available information, it's important to report data. The CDC, for example, and I'm super thrilled and happy that we were paired together, Katrina and I. The CDC, for example, is a really crucial data source for recovery planning practitioners such as myself to kind of quote unquote mine data and look for data to help inform critical habitat identification. And so many people, whether you're a research scientist, you're a consultant, you're a naturalist, etc. A lot of people collect data or view data, but if you keep that data, it's really challenging for someone like myself or the government to fully apply all data that's available unless it's publicly available. And so that's just my plug to report your data. Secondly, biophysical attributes. Biophysical attributes essentially in the recovery strategy or action plan typically are in a table format such as this. And so this is just a screenshot of, again, the example of spadefoot toad and what features and characteristics on the landscape are required to support survival and recovery of the spadefoot toad. And so the first top, I'll just go through the top part. I won't go through this entire table, but life stage, we've identified adult, juveniles, eggs, and tadpoles, and functions is basically all life functions: courtship, mating, egg laying, foraging, and development. And the feature that we're highlighting here are vernal ponds, seasonal and temporary wetlands. And then on the attribute side is a list of type of attributes and components that are required. So wet areas at any time, having shallow areas less than 1 meter depth, required for development of eggs and tadpoles, emergent vegetation, sticks, rocks, etc. Okay. And so if we go back to that mapping, the critical habitat mapping, again, this is the geospatial extent of CH. However, CH is only considered present on the landscape if the biophysical attributes required to support the species are also present. So there is a level of ground truthing that is required and necessary to determine if critical habitat is actually on the landscape. And this could be for a number of reasons. Land forms change, land tenure change, development happens, etc. But also with our accuracy of mapping, sometimes it's really challenging on very large scales. And so based on what critical habitat is based on, there could be areas that our mapping overlaps with roadways. edges of towns, parking lots, etc. And those type of areas are not necessarily required for, in this sense, a spadefoot toad to support the survival and recovery of spadefoot toads. Okay. So that's a really important component, is those biophysical attributes need to be on the landscape in order for CH to be present at that given area and location. Thirdly, activities likely to destroy CH, critical habitat. So understanding what constitutes destruction of CH is necessary for the protection and management of CH. And destruction is determined on a case-by-case basis. Destruction would result in critical habitat if critical habitat were degraded, either permanently or temporarily, such that it would not serve its function when needed by the species. Destruction may result from a single or multiple activities at one point in time, or from cumulative effects, for example, of one or more activities over time. Activities described in recovery documents, again, are typically in this kind of table format, and includes those likely to cause destruction of critical habitat for the species. I will say, though, that destructive activities are not necessarily limited to those identified in recovery documents. However, it is a very good point of reference to say, okay, this is the work we're doing. How could that affect or implicate CH? And then again, lastly, schedule of studies to identify CH. If critical habitat is not fully completed or sufficient to meet those population and distribution objectives for the species, schedule of studies outlines the activities required to complete the identification of critical habitat. And so this section addresses parts of critical habitat that are known to be missing from the identification based on information that is available or unavailable at time of completion. And so what species have critical habitat? Essentially, species that are designated under the Species at Risk Act as endangered or threatened will have or may have critical habitat. And where I say yes or not yet is just in reference to Sarah, a species X may have been included on Schedule 1 as endangered, but we have not yet identified CH for that species because we are working on that species. So the take home from this is endangered and threatened species are the species under Sarah Schedule 1 that have critical habitat. In some instances, extirpated species will have CH. However, there is some nuance to that maybe not all the time. So just a little bit of as an aside. Okay, back to kind of where do these laws apply? And this is in part to critical habitat. And really, jurisdictions matter when CH is final. And so we have these kind of two broad terms for critical habitat: legal protection and effective protection. And so the legal protection is a term often used to describe the type of protection required under Section 58 when CH is located on federal lands. And effective protection is the term often required to describe the type of protection under Section 61 when critical habitat is located on non-federal lands. And so critical habitat on non-federal lands is considered effectively protected where provision in laws are in place of the province or territory that are based and have the same protection outcome as would be the case under the SARA prohibitions were in place. And so essentially provinces and territories are provided the first opportunity to manage CH on provincial and private lands. And protection on non-federal lands occurs in different ways: provincial and municipal laws, local laws, conservation and stewardship agreements. So for example, Section 11 under the SARA, as well as SARA Section 80 emergency protection orders, for example. And so the direct prohibition of the destruction of CH on non-federal lands only applies if the governor and council makes an order following a recommendation from the minister to bring prohibitions under Section 61 into effect. This occurs when the minister forms the opinion that any portion of CH is not effectively protected by the laws of province and territory. And this would be considered the SARA safety net, and it is intended to be a last resort when provinces and territories fail to take sufficient action to protect, manage SARA-listed species and their habitats. Okay, there was a lot of information there, and I apologize for that. And so, lastly, I know I'm kind of getting long in the tooth here, and so CH identification does not equal protection. And essentially, to kind of skim through this slide is that the identification of CH does not equal protection, and essentially the minister needs to make an order or a statement for those critical habitat prohibitions to be in place. And lastly, where to find critical habitat information. And so Katrina outlined this beautifully, and really the primary places to get those spatial information and spatial data is from the CDC iMap, as well as the BC data catalog that Katrina kind of outlined. And then obviously for information on biophysical attributes, threats, other components of the recovery document, those are published on the Species at Risk public registry. And so I know I just went through a lot of information in a short time and kind of rushed through at the end, but I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. And yeah, over to Purnima, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Jared. Yes, that was a lot of information that came through, but that's great. Like, as I said, the webinars are recorded, so we can sort of digest it and slowly. And now I'm going to invite Katrina back on to turn her camera on too. And we're ready for the question and answer. There are 16 questions already in the question and answer, but we're going to go with the most upvoted questions. So let me refresh that. And the first question is to Katrina, I think. And I'm going to summarize the question so we'll have more time for answers. The question is, how is Indigenous knowledge and culturally significant species included in CDC assessments?
Thank you for that question. It's a great one. My short answer is, to date, in the general standard of our conservation status assessments, it has not been considered as we would like it to be. It's definitely a topic that we have been talking about a lot at the CDC, though, and there have been some pilots around this topic. So not too long ago, we had an Indigenous youth intern that kind of helped us apply nature-served methodology of conservation status assessments to a culturally significant ecosystem that supported bitterroot. I believe it was with the Silk Nation, but our ecologists were involved in that. It's the nature-served methodology does allow for those various values to be considered. It can be applied also to anyone's backyard. So it's very scalable. I would just say that it's on our minds, and we're really interested to kind of venture in that direction. So I appreciate the question, and we're thinking about it, and I would love to talk more about it if you want to offline as well.
Yeah, it is such a complex issue to discuss in such a short time. So yeah, as Katrina welcomed direct contact, yeah, maybe that would be a good decision, a good way to go.
It would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so I've just refreshed the most upvotes, and the next question is from Natalie. Can you provide some, and I think this is directed towards Jared. Can anyone please provide some suggestions on how local governments can bolster their accountability to SAR? I think this is more like critical habitat. How can local governments focus on critical habitat more? So an outreach question, and maybe I'll send it towards Jared.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a tricky one for me to answer, just in a jurisdictional tenure speaking, but critical habitat is publicly available for everyone, though, that information, that documentation, the requirements for CH. And it's just it's those applications and considerations to CH when we're talking about land use planning or development planning or zoning, etc. And so how do local governments bolster those? That's a tough for me to answer. I guess, the kind of cheesy cliche one would be, well, the voters have a lot to do with that, right? At the same time. But I think, again, it's, maybe it's a sense of calling your local governments and reaching out to your local governments on asking how critical habitat is being considered, or how species at risk are being considered. But in the specific question about how can local governments bolster that, I can't have an answer to that. We do a lot of work with local governments and encouragement and outreach and education. These type of forums that the province has put together is a great resource as well. So that's probably what I would be able to say on that.
Great. Thanks, Jared. And it looks like there's a lot of interest in similar types of questions. So the next upvoted question is also on a similar vein. How could you suggest pursuing environmental due diligence for landowners who are destroying critical habitat and conservation areas of concern? This question is from Larissa, and I think to some extent you answered it in your previous question. Do you want to add anything else to that? I think we're focused so much on data this time, and there's guidance documents in the next webinars coming. But if either of you want to add anything to the answers you've already given, that would be great.
Yeah, I can jump in first, I guess, Katrina, if you wanted to go in after. It's really, how the SARA works. It's definitely a carrot and a stick legislation, right? The SARA provides the provincial government, the local government, private landowners, etc., the first opportunity to appropriately and effectively manage species at risk and their habitats. And if it gets to a point where those species are not being effectively protected or managed or conserved, then unfortunately the federal government may be forced to step in and become almost essentially the regulatory body on lands that are not federal when it comes to the SARA. And so that's kind of my assumption and my sense. And I think we have great resources, best management practices, critical habitat identification, recovery documents, COSEWIC documents to kind of inform people on, hey, maybe it's not necessarily do not do anything, but how can we further consider species on your lands or on these areas, etc.
Okay, Katrina, did you have anything to add? I know you're so data focused, but yeah, I just want to give you the opportunity.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. I don't have a lot to add to this. Other people will have much better answers. Just as an awareness, the CDC is kind of intentionally arm's length from policy, and that I see our responsibility just to get the information to people to help make those decisions, and to the best of our ability, keep it current. And that's where we focus our attention. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Ooh, there's a lot of interest in these two. That we have 17 questions and we just have 2 minutes. Very quickly, the next question that has the most upvotes, maybe I'll try taking a shot at answering that. It's about asking about SEER legislation and biodiversity and ecosystem health framework. I think that's more directed towards walrus. What we can say is we can give you an update on that, and I will contact the policy people who are working on that and provide an answer, written answer, when we post the answers to that, and use this last minute. Oh, we've got only a minute. Yeah, there are so many questions here. So I think I'm going to just, instead of trying to rush an answer, I'm just going to call um, the questions and we will share these questions with both the presenters, and we'll also take a look at the questions and try and provide thoughtful answers when we can. And the answers will be posted along with the recording of the webinar. So we usually take a week, a little bit over a week, to post those answers. So we will do that. And given that we're already at 1 o'clock, oh my God, time just flies. I just want to remind you again that there'll be a survey as you leave. There is another webinar next week, and that will focus on our best management practices and guidance documents, which might actually provide an answer for some of the questions that were asked today. And I again want to thank you all very much for taking this lunchtime to join us for this series. And it's incredible to see the interest that there is in these topics. So again, thank you very much. And thanks very much to both our speakers for joining us today. With that, thank you. Remember the survey, and we'll see you next week.